Nevada sun had baked the 8-year-old's hope into dust for 3 agonizing days. He sat alone on a cracked concrete curb, abandoned and relentlessly hunted. Then the ground began to tremble. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the deafening, earth-shattering roar of 500 Hell's Angels coming for him. Toby Harrison adjusted his sweaty grip on the faded straps of his nylon superhero backpack. The rough, sun-baked concrete of the parking bumper radiated a blistering heat through his thin denim jeans, but the 8-year-old refused to move a single inch. "Wait right here on this exact curb, Toby," his mother Rachel had instructed him, her voice trembling in a way he had never heard before. Her hands had gripped the steering wheel of their rusting 1998 Ford Taurus so hard her knuckles gleamed white against her tanned skin. She had kept glancing in the rearview mirror, her eyes wide with a frantic, suffocating terror. "Don't talk to anyone. Keep the backpack zipped tight. I have to fix a mistake, but I'll be back before the streetlights come on. I promise." With the screech of worn tires against asphalt, she had sped off down the desolate stretch of Highway 95, swallowed by the shimmering heat waves of the Nevada desert. That was Tuesday morning. It was now Thursday evening, and the flickering neon sign of Maggie's Route 95 Rest was humming to life for the third time since Rachel drove away. The diner was a decaying relic sitting just outside the unforgiving, dusty town of Beatty. It saw a sparse rotation of weary truckers and lost tourists, none of whom paid much attention to the small boy sitting stubbornly by the ice machine. But Maggie O'Connell, the diner's owner and sole waitress, noticed. She was a tough, leather-skinned woman in her late 50s who had spent a lifetime watching people run from their ghosts. On the first day, Maggie assumed the boy's parents were just arguing in a car parked out of sight, or that a mother had locked her keys inside. By the second day, a cold dread settled in her stomach. She had brought Toby plates of French fries and tall glasses of ice water. He accepted the water, gulping it down with parched desperation, but barely touched the food. Whenever she tried to coax him inside the air-conditioned diner, he would shake his head violently, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "If I go inside, she might not see me when she drives up," Toby had whispered, his voice hoarse from the dry, alkaline wind. "I have to stay on the curb." What Maggie didn't know, what no one knew, was that Rachel Harrison had not willingly abandoned her son. Rachel was a mid-level bookkeeper for a sprawling, vicious logistics company in Las Vegas that served as a front for an illegal arms syndicate. When she had stumbled upon a hidden digital ledger, exposing the identities of the organization's highest-ranking enforcers and their political payouts, she knew her life was forfeit. In a moment of sheer panic, she had downloaded the ledger onto a heavy, encrypted hard drive, shoved it to the bottom of Toby's backpack beneath a pile of comic books, and fled. She had dropped Toby at the diner to keep him out of the crossfire, intending to drive to an FBI field office in Carson City to turn over the evidence and negotiate protection. She never made it. 30 miles outside of Batty, a black SUV had run her off the road. As Thursday bled into Friday morning, the reality of Toby's situation grew dire. The boy was suffering. His pale cheeks were badly sunburned, his lips cracked and bleeding, and the dark circles under his eyes spoke of 3 days of profound, terrified sleeplessness. He clutched the backpack to his chest like a shield. Inside the diner, Maggie was losing her patience with the local authorities. She had called the county sheriff's department twice. Deputy Thomas Hodges, a man known more for his gambling debts than his badge, had brushed her off. "Kids get left behind by deadbeat parents all the time, Maggie," Hodges had drawled over the phone. "I've got a multi-car pileup on the interstate. I'll send child services out there tomorrow when I have the manpower." Maggie slammed the receiver down. She looked out the grease-stained window at the small, hunched figure on the curb. She knew the desert. She knew the kind of darkness it harbored. and she knew that whoever Rachel Harrison was running from was likely already retracing her steps. "All right, kid," Maggie muttered to herself, pulling off her apron. "I'm not letting you sit out there to die." She walked over to the cash register and reached underneath the heavy wooden counter, her fingers wrapping around the cold steel of her late husband's Remington 870 pump-action shotgun. She kept it loaded with rock salt and birdshot. She didn't know why, but the hairs on the back of her neck were standing up. The desert was too quiet. Friday morning brought a suffocating heat that settled over the gas station like a heavy woolen blanket. It was 10 a.m., the 72-hour mark since Toby had been left behind. The boy's head was drooping, his chin resting on the top of his backpack. He was slipping into the dangerous lethargic territory of severe dehydration. The silence of the parking lot was suddenly shattered by the crunch of heavy tires on gravel. A sleek, heavily tinted black Lincoln Navigator rolled off the highway, moving with predatory slowness. It bypassed the gas pumps and idled directly in front of the diner, casting a long, dark shadow over the cracked concrete where Toby sat. Maggie watched from behind the counter, her heart hammering against her ribs. She grabbed the Remington and moved toward the front door. Two men stepped out of the SUV. They did not look like tourists, and they certainly didn't look like locals. They wore sharp, dark suits that seemed entirely out of place in the Nevada dirt, and their movements were calculated, sharp, and entirely devoid of warmth. The driver, a towering man named Gideon with a jagged scar running along his jawline, scanned the area before his eyes locked onto the small boy on the curb. The passenger, Cole, smirked and adjusted the lapel of his jacket, discreetly checking the heavy bulge near his waistband. They had found Rachel's wrecked Taurus 2 days ago. It had taken them this long to beat the truth out of her that she didn't have the hard drive, that she had left it with her son. Gideon walked toward Toby, his expensive leather shoes crunching softly in the dirt. He knelt down, attempting a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Hey there, buddy," Gideon said, his voice a low, gravelly purr. "You, Toby? Your mom, Rachel, sent us. She's waiting for you. She's real worried about you, kid. She told us you had a backpack for her." Toby blinked, his bleary eyes trying to focus. His mother had told him never to leave the curb. She had also told him with tears in her eyes to run if anyone ever asked about the backpack. The boy instinctively hugged the bag tighter to his chest and scooted backward along the concrete, his sneakers scraping against the ground. "No," Toby croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Mom said, "Wait." Cole stepped forward, his patience instantly evaporating. "Listen, you little brat, we don't have time for this. Hand over the bag and get in the truck." He reached out, his massive hand aiming for Toby's shoulder. "Step away from the boy." The harsh, commanding voice cracked like a whip across the parking lot. Gideon and Cole froze, turning slowly to see Maggie standing on the porch of the diner. She had the Remington raised, the stock pressed firmly against her shoulder, the barrel aimed squarely at Gideon's chest. Gideon let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Lady, you have absolutely no idea what you're stepping into. Put the antique down before you get hurt." "I said step away," Maggie repeated, her finger tightening on the trigger. "The boy isn't going anywhere with you." Cole's hand slipped inside his jacket, wrapping around the grip of a suppressed 9mm pistol. "We're taking the kid, lady. If you pull that trigger, you'll be dead before the recoil hits your shoulder." The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Toby was crying now, silent tears streaking through the dust on his face. Maggie held her ground, but she knew she was outmatched. These were professional killers. She was just a waitress making a desperate stand. Then something shifted. It didn't start as a sound, but as a vibration. A low, rhythmic trembling that seemed to rise up from the very bedrock of the desert. Small pebbles on the asphalt began to dance. The half-empty cup of water near Toby's foot showed tiny, concentric ripples. Gideon frowned, looking down at the ground, then toward the highway. Over the crest of the hill on Highway 95, a single motorcycle appeared. It was a massive, custom-built Harley-Davidson, its chrome gleaming like a weapon in the morning sun. The rider wore a heavy leather vest adorned with a menacing death's head patch, the iconic winged skull of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Behind him came another, then two more, then 10. Within seconds, the horizon was swallowed by a tidal wave of roaring machinery. The earth-shattering thunder of 500 V twin engines tore through the quiet desert air, a deafening mechanical symphony that drowned out all other sound. The air filled with the smell of exhaust, burning rubber, and raw, unfiltered power. Gideon and Cole took a stunned step back, their hands dropping away from their weapons. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the arriving force was paralyzing. The procession of bikers didn't just pass by, they swarmed the diner. Hundreds of Hell's Angels poured into the parking lot, surrounding the gas pumps, blocking the highway in both directions, and completely enclosing the Black Lincoln Navigator in a fortress of heavy metal and hardened men. The roar of the engines was a physical force, vibrating violently in the chests of everyone standing there. At the front of the pack, a man the size of a mountain cut his engine and kicked down his stand. His name was Big John Harrison. He was the sergeant-at-arms for the Oakland charter of the Hells Angels. He was also Rachel's estranged older brother and Toby's uncle. When Rachel realized her car was being run off the road 3 days ago, she knew the police wouldn't get there in time. She had made one final desperate phone call to the only person she knew who possessed enough ruthless power to wage a war against a syndicate. She had called her brother. Big John dismounted, his heavy combat boots hitting the dust. He removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that burned with a cold, terrifying fury. He looked at the two men in suits, then at the exhausted boy clutching the backpack. The 500 engines suddenly cut out in unison. The ensuing silence was heavier and far more dangerous than the noise had been. Big John cracked his knuckles, a sound like snapping branches in the quiet lot. He took a slow, deliberate step toward Gideon. "I believe," Big John rumbled, his voice carrying the weight of an impending storm, "you're standing a little too close to my nephew." The silence that followed the synchronized death of 500 V-twin engines was absolute and terrifying. The desert wind, usually a constant, howling companion on Highway 95, seemed to hold its breath. The heavy scent of burning rubber, hot oil, and exhaust fumes hung thick in the blistering Nevada air, a chemical testament to the army that had just materialized out of the heat haze. Big John Harrison stood an imposing 6'5", his broad shoulders stretching the worn leather of his cut. The iconic winged death's head of the Oakland charter was emblazoned across his back, but it was the look in his eyes that rooted Gideon and Cole to the spot. It was a look of cold, calculated violence, the kind of look a predator gives its prey just before the final strike. To John's left stepped Dutch Vanderwall, a heavily tattooed enforcer whose bare arms were crisscrossed with pale scars. To his right was Reaper Collins, a man whose silence was far more unnerving than his massive frame. Behind them, rank upon rank of hardened men dismounted, their heavy boots crunching against the gravel. They didn't draw weapons, nor did they need to. The sheer, overwhelming gravitational pull of 500 men surrounding a single, isolated diner was enough to crush the oxygen out of the air. Maggie O'Connell slowly lowered her Remington shotgun, her hands trembling for the first time that day. She let out a long, shuddering breath, keeping her eyes fixed on the bikers. She had lived in the desert long enough to know when the food chain had shifted. Gideon's jaw tightened. He was a professional, a man paid exorbitant sums to make problems disappear for Las Vegas's most dangerous power brokers. But there was no protocol for this. His hand hovered inches from his shoulder holster, his mind racing through a dozen different scenarios, all of them ending with him and Cole bleeding out on the cracked asphalt. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Gideon said, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogant purr. He carefully kept his hands visible, palms facing outward. We're just here to pick up the boy for his mother. She's indisposed. Big John didn't blink. He closed the distance between them with agonizing slowness, his heavy combat boots kicking up small clouds of alkali dust. He stopped less than 2 feet from Gideon, towering over the syndicate fixer. My sister? Big John's voice was a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate in Gideon's chest. Would rather walk barefoot through hell than send a cheap suit-wearing bottom feeder to pick up her son. Toby, still sitting on the curb with his faded superhero backpack clutched desperately to his chest, looked up. Through the layers of dirt, sunburn, and exhausted tears, recognition finally sparked in his wide eyes. "Uncle John," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. Big John's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as he looked past Gideon to the small, broken figure on the curb. "I'm here, Toby. Nobody is going to touch you." Cole, sweating profusely through his expensive charcoal jacket, made a fatal miscalculation. Panic overriding his training, his hand darted toward his waistband for his suppressed 9mm. He never even cleared the holster. Dutch moved with a blinding, terrifying speed that defied his massive bulk. His hand shot out, clamping around Cole's wrist like a steel vise. With a sharp, sickening twist, Cole's arm was wrenched behind his back. A gasp of agony tore from the fixer's lips as Dutch effortlessly slammed his face into the hood of the idling Lincoln Navigator. The heavy metal dented under the impact. The suppressed pistol clattered harmlessly onto the dirt. A low murmur rippled through the hundreds of bikers, a collective menacing growl of anticipation. Gideon froze entirely. He knew that if he moved a single muscle, he would be torn apart. Big John didn't even look at Cole. He kept his dead, empty eyes locked on Gideon. "You have exactly 10 seconds to tell me where Rachel is, or I'm going to let my brothers tie you to the back of my bike and see how much of you is left by the time we hit the county line." Gideon swallowed hard, his throat dry. The syndicate paid well, but they didn't pay enough to endure the wrath of the Hells Angels. He needed leverage, and he needed it now. "She's alive," Gideon blurted out, the composure completely bleeding from his voice. "She's alive, but she won't be if we don't return with that backpack." Big John leaned in closer. "Where?" "Blackwood Salvage," Gideon confessed, his eyes darting frantically to the sea of leather and chrome surrounding them. "It's a scrapyard off Interstate 15, 20 miles outside Vegas. They're holding her there. The boss, he wants the digital ledger she stole. He ordered us to bring the kid to force the exchange. If we don't check in by noon, they're going to put a bullet in her head." Big John processed the information with chilling stoicism. He turned slightly and nodded to Reaper. "Take their phones. Zip-tie them to the steering wheel of their own truck. Take the keys." As Reaper and Dutch efficiently neutralized the two fixers, Big John finally walked over to the curb. He knelt down, the joints in his heavy knees popping loudly in the quiet lot. He reached out a massive, calloused hand and gently wiped a tear from Toby's filthy cheek. "You did good, kid," Big John said softly, the menacing gravel leaving his voice entirely. "You did exactly what your mama told you to do. You held the line." Toby practically collapsed into his uncle's arms, the adrenaline that had kept him awake for 3 days finally evaporating. He buried his face in Big John's leather vest, sobbing uncontrollably. Big John wrapped his arms around the boy, holding him tight. He looked up at Maggie, who was still standing on the diner porch. "Ma'am," Big John said, tipping his chin in a gesture of profound respect. "My club owes you a debt that money can't repay. You stood between a wolf and the lamb." Maggie gave a shaky, curt nod, leaning the shotgun against the doorframe. "Just go get his mother, Mr. Harrison. Bring her back to him." Big John stood up, lifting Toby effortlessly with one arm. He unzipped the boy's backpack, reached past the comic books, and pulled out the heavy, encrypted hard drive. He stared at the small piece of metal that had caused so much destruction, his jaw set in a grim line. He slipped it into the inner pocket of his cut. He turned to face his men. 500 pairs of eyes stared back, waiting for the command. "We ride for Blackwood," Big John roared, his voice echoing across the desolate plains. "We don't stop, we don't yield. Today we burn an empire to the ground." The response was immediate and deafening. 500 engines roared back to life, a mechanical war cry that shook the earth. The convoy of heavy metal thundered down the burning asphalt of Interstate 15 like a localized hurricane. Vehicles swerved onto the shoulders, truckers blasted their horns in awe, and highway patrol cruisers wisely turned their heads the other way. You don't pull over a 500-strong column of the Hell's Angels. You just pray they aren't coming for you. Big John rode at the head of the spear, the wind whipping his beard, his mind locked onto one singular violent objective. He had handed Toby over to his most trusted confidant, a gray-bearded veteran named Pops Callahan, who was driving the club's heavily armored support van at the center of the pack. Toby was finally asleep, exhausted and safe behind bulletproof glass and 30 tons of rolling steel. 20 miles outside the neon glow of Las Vegas, the desert landscape turned industrial. Blackwood Salvage sat like a rusted scar on the edge of the city, a sprawling 20-acre graveyard of crushed cars, shipping containers, and corrugated iron warehouses. It was surrounded by a 10-foot chain-link fence topped with razor wire, acting as the perfect secluded fortress for the syndicate's darkest operations. Inside the main warehouse, a suffocatingly hot structure that smelled of decaying oil and rat droppings, Rachel Harrison was tied to a heavy steel chair. Her face was bruised, her lips split, and her clothes were torn from 3 days of relentless interrogation. Standing before her was Silas, the syndicate's chief lieutenant, a meticulously groomed man whose designer suit was horribly incongruous with the filth of the scrapyard. "It's 11:45, Rachel," Silas said, checking a platinum watch. "Gideon and Cole haven't checked in. That means they have the boy and they are ensuring the hard drive is intact. But if they don't call in the next 15 minutes, my patience expires." Rachel glared at him through a swollen eye. Her spirit was battered, but she knew what was on that drive. It wasn't just money. It was the names of corrupt judges, dirty cops, and the exact supply routes of illegal firearms flooding the West Coast. "If you touch my son," Rachel spat, blood speckling her chin, "my brother will hunt you to the ends of the earth." Silas laughed, a thin, reedy sound. "Your brother is a thug on a motorcycle. He is a relic. We own the police, Rachel. We own the judges. A biker gang is nothing but a speed bump." At exactly 11:50 a.m., the ground beneath the warehouse began to vibrate. It started as a subtle tremor, rattling the loose tools on the metal workbenches. Then a low, ominous hum filled the air, rapidly building into a deafening mechanical roar. Silas frowned, stepping away from Rachel and looking toward the heavy, rolling steel doors of the warehouse. His 4-armed guards exchanged nervous glances, raising their automatic rifles. Outside, the siege began with shocking, brutal efficiency. The syndicate had posted guards at the main gate, but they never stood a chance. The Hells Angels didn't stop to negotiate. The armored club van, driven by Pops, accelerated to 60 miles an hour, smashing through the reinforced chain-link gates like they were made of tissue paper. The gates tore off their hinges in a shower of sparks and shrieking metal. Behind the van, the tidal wave hit. Hundreds of bikers flooded into the compound, a chaotic, swirling storm of leather and chrome. They fanned out with military precision, creating a massive, impenetrable perimeter of roaring engines that trapped everyone inside the scrapyard. Silas guards rushed out of the smaller trailers, weapons raised, but they were instantly paralyzed by the sheer scale of the invasion. It wasn't a gang, it was a mobilized army. Everywhere they looked, imposing men were dismounting, pulling heavy steel pipes, heavy chains, and firearms from their saddlebags. Inside the warehouse, the noise was deafening. Silas' face went pale. The arrogance drained from his eyes, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. "Shoot the door!" Silas screamed over the din, pointing at the heavy steel entrance. "Lock it down!" Before the guards could move, the front of a custom-built, 1,000-pound Harley-Davidson Road Glide smashed through the corrugated aluminum siding of the warehouse, completely bypassing the reinforced door. The bike tore through the metal wall like a missile, sending shrapnel and dust flying across the room. Big John Harrison stepped through the jagged hole, the dust settling around his massive frame. Behind him poured Dutch, Reaper, and 20 of the club's most vicious enforcers. The 4 syndicate guards raised their rifles, but they were outgunned and vastly outnumbered within seconds. The sharp mechanical clacking of a dozen shotguns being pumped echoed through the warehouse, entirely drowning out the sound of the idling motorcycles outside. "Drop 'em," Big John commanded, his voice slicing through the chaos. The guards looked at Big John, then at the heavily armed bikers surrounding them, and finally at Silas. Slowly, one by one, they lowered their rifles and dropped them onto the oily concrete floor, raising their hands in surrender. They weren't paid enough to die in a scrapyard. Silas backed away, tripping over a rusted engine block. He scrambled backward, his pristine suit ruined by grease and dirt. Big John ignored him. He strode straight to the center of the room, drawing a heavy hunting knife from his belt. In 3 quick, fluid motions, he sliced through the thick zip ties binding Rachel to the steel chair. Rachel collapsed forward, sobbing. Big John caught her effortlessly, wrapping his massive arms around her trembling frame. "I got you, Ratch," Big John whispered into her hair, his eyes closing briefly as relief washed over him. "I got you. Toby is safe. He's outside with Pops." Rachel buried her face in his leather vest, her tears soaking into the heavy material. "The drive, John," she gasped between sobs. "They can't get the drive. They'll kill us all." Big John pulled the encrypted hard drive from his pocket and held it up. He looked over Rachel's shoulder at Silas, who was trembling in the corner of the warehouse. "Oh, we're not keeping it," Big John said, a dark, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He looked at Reaper, who tossed a burner phone to his president. Big John dialed a number, putting the phone on speaker. It rang twice before it was answered. "William," Big John said into the phone. "Did you get the files we transmitted from the diner?" On the other end of the line was William Hayes, a high-powered defense attorney on retainer for the Hells Angels. "I got them, John. I just walked out of the federal building. The FBI task force has the ledger. They're mobilizing on the syndicate's headquarters in Las Vegas as we speak. Warrants are being signed right now." Silas' eyes widened in sheer horror. The bikers hadn't just come to break heads. They had played the syndicate's own game, using the club's legal muscle to detonate a nuclear bomb on the organization's political and financial infrastructure. Big John hung up the phone and tossed it aside. He looked down at Silas. "You told my sister that we were just speed bumps. But you forgot the #1 rule of the road, suit." Big John leaned down, his shadow entirely eclipsing the broken man on the floor. "When you stand in the middle of the highway, you're the one who gets run over." Big John turned his back on Silas, wrapping his arm protectively around his sister. "Dutch, tie him up. Leave him for the feds." As Big John escorted Rachel out of the suffocating warehouse and into the blinding Nevada sunlight, the sea of bikers parted for them. Cheers and the revving of engines greeted them, a thunderous celebration of victory. Pops opened the heavy door of the armored van. Toby was awake, his face pressed against the glass. When he saw his mother, he practically flew out of the vehicle, running across the dirt and burying himself in her arms. Rachel fell to her knees, clutching her son as if she would never let him go, burying her face in his neck and weeping with unbridled joy. Big John stood a few feet away, watching his family reunite. The sun was beginning to set over the Mojave Desert, casting long golden shadows across the scrapyard. The empire that had hunted them was crumbling into dust, dismantled by the unlikeliest of saviors. Toby's agonizing weight on the sun-baked concrete ended not in tragedy, but within the thunderous embrace of an unexpected family. The syndicate learned a brutal, fatal lesson about the unbreakable bonds of blood and brotherhood. By turning the ledger over to the authorities, the club dismantled an empire, ensuring Toby and Rachel would never have to look over their shoulders again, forever protected by the highway's fiercest guardians.